This probably won't be a case that you have heard about before, even if you follow true crime cases like I do. I only know about this tragedy because the victim was my grandmother, Hazelle Fenty, who was brutally assaulted and murdered on her 76th birthday inside the church she attended. The year 2022 marked the 30th anniversary of her death, and the crime remains unsolved. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement continues to work towards unmasking her killer, who has now had 3 decades to enjoy his life without repercussions. And it is a he, we know that much. But beyond that, there are scant details about him. We don't know the who yet, but we know the where. The Indigo Lakes Baptist Church of Daytona Beach, Florida. It had been founded just 3 years before her death in 1989 by the Reverend John Nichol, who was an important figure in Hazelle's life as well as her death, being the last known person to see her alive, and only a short time later, he would also discover her body. The one-story, sharply angled building was designed for functionality over form. It was located only blocks from the International Daytona Speedway and just off the southern reach of I-95, which runs north to south from Miami to Maine. The small parking lot was enclosed by large trees that obscured the building from its surroundings. So, despite being an urban location, the church was a secluded spot where you wouldn't go unless you had a reason to go there. Hazelle's reason was that she worked there. As well as being a founding member of the congregation and ordained as a deacon, she also acted as its secretary and bookkeeper. And so, after celebrating her birthday with the pastor and his wife at their home, Hazelle and Nichol went to the church to work on the afternoon of Friday, December 4th, 1992. Nichol would later tell the officers arriving on the scene that he left the church around 4:15 p.m. He said goodbye to Hazelle, who was in her office making photocopies of the latest church bulletin at that time. She told him she would be leaving around 5 p.m., which means that, in all likelihood, it was somewhere in that tight window of 45 minutes that Hazelle was murdered. The officers noted the photocopy machine was still on when they arrived. Hazelle spent her entire life in Daytona Beach. She'd been born Hazelle Louise Rockwood on December 4th, 1916, in Lunenburg, Massachusetts. Her father, an out-of-work carpenter in the wake of World War I, struggling to support his family, made the dramatic decision to relocate his wife and 4-year-old daughter to the booming Florida coast, where construction work was plentiful. Hazelle and her mother would board a steamship in Boston bound for Jacksonville, where they would meet him, waiting to transport them in a mule and wagon to their new home in Florida. In her later years, Hazelle was an avid collector. She loved antique dolls, particularly Kewpie dolls. I remember large glass cases in her house, which housed dozens, if not hundreds of them, of all sizes and periods. She also loved historic postcards and memorabilia of Daytona and the surrounding areas. Her large collection was eventually donated to the Halifax Historical Society, where she was an active volunteer and past president. Fascinated with the history of the Daytona Beach area, Hazelle helped collect, edit, and prepare several published books and articles about the history of the place. Daytona Beach is perhaps best known as the headquarters for NASCAR. The city has a long history of attracting motorsports and racing enthusiasts due to the compacted quality of the sand, which allowed for fast, open-area racing. Early races were held literally on Daytona Beach. By the time Hazelle moved there in 1920, speedsters already flocked to the area to test the limits of acceleration for what was then a relatively new invention, the automobile. These days, Daytona Beach is also the destination for an annual flood of spring breakers, which descend upon it. And unsurprisingly, tourism is a major industry in a city which saw over 4 million visitors in 2004. But Daytona Beach is not all fun and games and can be a, quote, slightly unsafe place to visit. There is the darker element of the city, which, given its expected yearly influx of tourists and partiers, sees a relatively large amount of criminal activity. The murder rate is currently 3 times higher than the national average, on a par with larger cities like Houston and Philadelphia. As recently as March of 2022, a married couple riding on their way home from Bike Week festivities was found dead with their throats slashed, with no apparent motive. This is eerily similar to how Hazelle died 3 decades before, the victim of a seemingly senseless knife attack by a killer still at large. Furthermore, Volusia County, where Daytona Beach and its neighboring municipalities lie, has been the hunting ground for a number of serial killers throughout the years. Gerald Stano was arrested in 1980 and linked to 33 murders from the prior decade. Eileen Wuornos, portrayed by Charlize Theron in the 2003 biopic Monster, was arrested in Volusia County in 1991, and more recently in the mid-2000s, a string of women were killed by a perpetrator dubbed the Daytona Beach Killer. He evaded law enforcement for over a decade until the new technology known as genetic genealogy solved this case in 2019. With all these serial killers hunting the streets of Daytona throughout the decades, one might wonder if Hazelle were the victim of some random crime of opportunity. But stranger killings are statistically rare, with the vast majority of these types of crimes being perpetrated by those known to their victims. There isn't enough evidence at this point, one way or the other, to rule out either of these possibilities. I have read research articles on other cases that share similarities to Hazelle's, and one conclusion drawn is that, statistically, the perpetrator often walks to these sorts of crime scenes and/or resides close by. I don't know if this has relevance or not, but whoever it was, they were not interested in Hazelle's car. It was the only vehicle in the parking lot, and the police found it unlocked, with the windows down, and the keys sitting in plain view on the passenger's seat. This would have been nearly impossible for the killer to miss. Additionally, investigators had reason to believe that a faded red pickup may have been involved, which was seen driving away from the area around 5 p.m. or just after. The police told a reporter for the Orlando Sentinel that they were looking for the driver, quote, who may have seen suspicious people or activity. Usually, that means they suspect the driver wasn't just a witness, but no useful information was ever gleaned from this lead. Paul Wilson, Jr., is Hazelle's eldest child from her first marriage. Growing up, I knew him as Uncle Sandy. He served his country in Vietnam, was stationed in Berlin when the wall fell, lost part of his finger to a wayward saw, and kept parrots and other exotic birds as a hobby. Like his mother, Uncle Sandy grew up and lived most of his life in Daytona Beach. He lived just down the street from her, wanting to be close in order to assist her as she grew older. On the day of the crime, he and his wife were expecting Hazelle to show up around 5:30 or 6 p.m. to their house, but she failed to arrive. Paul gave his mother another hour to appear, in the event she had just been held up for some reason. But when he hadn't heard from her by 7 p.m., he knew something was wrong. He phoned Nickel, who agreed to go to the church and check on her, as he lived only a few minutes away. Quote, my suspicion was that she had a stroke or a fall, Nickel would later tell a reporter for the Orlando Sentinel. So Nickel drove to the church. He found it odd that the lights in the church nursery were on. He could see them through partially open blinds. The childcare area of the church was close to the main entrance, but there was no apparent reason why Hazelle would be in that part of the church. Her office was in the back, next to his. And the church was a large building with 17 entrances. Nickel later told police that when he said goodbye to her a few hours before, the numerous entrances were all locked, with one exception. That was a rear door, which was close to Hazelle's office, which both of them used to leave the building. An arriving officer made an exterior examination of the building and found no signs of forced entry through either windows or doors. So either Hazelle knew her killer and let him in, or he made entry through that single unlocked door. It's highly unlikely she would have opened the door to a strange man she didn't know. So this piece of information, the unlocked door, confounds the question of, did Hazelle know her killer? Was he familiar with the church building and its grounds? Did he know the door would be unlocked? Or did he check all 17? And if so, what was his reason for doing so? Why was he there? We still don't have the answer to these questions. Noticing that the nursery light was on, Nickel parked parked by that entrance and entered the church there. So right away, he found her body. As this is still an ongoing investigation, I can't give out many details on how she was found. I only know a few myself. She had been viciously stabbed, and there were clearly signs of a struggle in the nursery. Obviously deceased, Nickel did not try to render aid or touch her. Instead, he called his wife and told her to phone the police, and then he called Uncle Sandy to tell him he'd found her. Engine 4 of the Daytona Beach Fire Department arrived first on the scene at 7:35 p.m., and then several police officers arrived within 5 minutes of that. The first one on the scene entered and swept the interior for anyone else present, but found no one. There were no other signs of a struggle in any other part of the church, and there is only one thing that seemed out of place upon subsequent examination of the building's interior. This was in Nickel's office, which was next to Hazel's, where she had last been seen working on the bulletin. Protruding horizontally from one of his desk drawers was a red plastic ruler, which was usually kept in the desk. The drawer was closed, and the ruler was sticking out in a strange way. Nickel did not have an explanation for why it was like that. He had not left it like that, and he was pretty sure Hazel wouldn't have left it like that if she had gone into his office to retrieve the ruler for some reason. A search of the surrounding woods revealed a few items, such as cigarette butts and empty cans, which were taken into evidence and examined, but without any new leads developing from that. There have been a few persons of interest, which were investigated, but as of this date, there is no conclusive evidence to point law enforcement towards a definitive answer for who is responsible or why, though I'm sure they know more than I do. My purpose with this video is to rekindle interest in my grandmother's case and hopefully generate new leads. This is not a for-profit channel, but please support it in YouTube's algorithm by liking, subscribing, and sharing it. Thanks for your interest, and I believe that one day, with your help, we can bring closure to my family and bring Hazel's killer to justice.